Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Engineering Culture Tech Talk. My name is Amber Behrens. I'm a software engineer in the Unified Platform Services group, and today I have the privilege of introducing to you Doug Durham. Doug is the co-founder and CEO of Don't Panic Labs, a firm that helps companies and entrepreneurs innovate through design and development of software technologies. Doug has more than 3 decades of software engineering experience in a number of different industries. He's passionate about the process of solving problems through software and the application of sound engineering principles and patterns to these effects. Doug is a proud Husker and has an electrical engineering degree from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where he has also taught in recent years. Doug has recently released his first book titled Lean Software Systems Engineering for Developers. Welcome, Durham.
Thanks, Amber. Hi, everyone. Before I get started, I wanted to mention that I'm going to cover a number of slides today. And at the end, I have some potential resources for you, and my contact information is there. So if you want a copy of the slides, you can just reach out to me and I'd be happy to send them to you. My talk today is about software developer maturity and growth. I've been in this industry for over 30 years now, and if you've been doing anything for a really long time, you start to realize how valuable cumulative experience is and how much you lean on that, especially if you start working with younger people in your company or in your community. This longevity of experience often puts you in a position to reflect about what you've learned over those years, and there are some patterns you might start to recognize as your industry changes. Most people in the software industry today probably went to college and majored in computer science, or they have a degree in data science or software development. But surprisingly, I'm not one of those people. My undergraduate education, as Amber said, is in electrical engineering. And I thought I'd share this little gem with you. This is one of my actual textbooks from the 1980s, which I pulled out of a box in my basement. It is the only programming class I took in college. That is it. So I am one of those people who has had to learn this field on their own. I used to think that this was a considerable liability. And for a while, it was a real liability because I was missing a lot of knowledge and information that would have been useful. But over time, I started to realize that this was really an advantage for me personally. And there's a couple of reasons for this. I needed to fully understand the gaps in my knowledge and skills, and then try to figure out what the resources were that I could use to try to fill those gaps. I actively immersed myself in this learning process. I also had the advantage of working in organizations where I could apply what I learned. I know this experience is not available to everybody, but once I had the chance to put what I was learning together with my other experiences in engineering, I started to really understand the breadth and depth of software development and how it should be treated as a software engineering discipline. I helped start a company about 12 years ago called Don't Panic Labs. And when we started that company, we knew that we wanted to build a culture that had a strong desire to practice software development as an engineering discipline. It became a great laboratory for us to really put these things into practice and really try to grow and evolve this and really see what it looked like. As a result, the people that work in that organization have a path to growth that has really been defined by how well they grasp what we're trying to do. So all of this is a little background and context for what I want to talk about today. First, I'm going to try to characterize or illustrate what I've observed as the stages of developer maturation. And again, this is primarily from my own experience. Then I want to combine that with some reflection or some ideas about what the path to growing through these stages might look like and where people should focus. Now, when I started thinking about this, how people grow and mature in this industry, my brain leapt right to those people that I've worked with over the last 30 years that were at the pinnacle of their profession. What were the things that really stood out about these people? What stands out to me foremost is that they learn profoundly from their experiences. They don't just kind of realize that they're learning things as they go, but they actually are active about trying to leverage that. You know, we often talk about how much pain we suffer in software. They don't just endure the pain, they look for ways to overcome that, to prevent that from happening. When we are younger, we tend to gravitate to the more clever or esoteric solutions to problems or try to use fringe technologies. But as people mature, they realize, hey, you know what? If I find a simpler solution now, it's probably going to pay off in the long run. An experienced developer really knows there aren't any bonus points for being clever. And we have an expression at Don't Panic Labs where we say someone has the ability to, quote, see around the corners. This is the ability to anticipate things not just as they are, but to see where things might be going, and to build that into their decision-making and trade-offs that they're doing. Mature engineers recognize that trade-offs are the norm and absolutes are rare. Generally in life, when you're younger, you tend to think that things are pretty much black and white, or yes, no, or right or wrong. As time passes, though, you start to realize that the world is really more shades of gray. And that's very true in every field of engineering, which means we're constantly making a trade-off between two potentially desirable outcomes. And that becomes the norm of what we're doing. People at the top of this profession invest in themselves. They recognize the limits of their knowledge, and they're very active about trying to overcome those limits. As a result of that, their skills and knowledge tend to transcend the technologies and the frameworks or even the programming language that they're using. And this skill makes them way more valuable to the teams that they're on. They understand the importance of repeatable processes that create successful results. They're really more focused on how we're doing things and not necessarily the what or the what with. They also know when you start to pursue a software engineering mindset, it's important to be disciplined and structured. You want to have strong beliefs and strong ideas about how to do things, but you don't want to get so dogmatic that you're not open to new ideas of how things should be done. People at the top in this profession understand the importance of process and discipline, but they won't let ineffective processes get in the way. You don't want to just adopt things because you read about it in a book and then think, well, that must be the way to do it, right? We don't want to blindly adopt what they call a cargo culture, if you will. We want to make sure we're discerning and try out new processes or techniques that may help solve some problems, and then discard those things that really are not working or providing guidance. We want to be as lean as possible. The best devs are also obsessed with quality. The first thing I think about when I think of the best developers I've ever worked with is not how skilled they were as programmers, but actually how good they were as testers, the way they planned testing, the rigor to which they designed and tested their code. You know, I tell young developers all the time, if you really want to differentiate yourself from the rest of your peers, get really good at testing and be the person that everybody looks to who creates and tests their code better than anyone else. They also understand that it's not just about programming. It's about the design and how we maintain these systems over time. We don't just build version 1, throw it out there, and move on to the next project. Any software that's really worth anything evolves over time, and the only way that we can be effective is to invest in good design. And then when a decision needs to be made in the heat of the moment, when we need to do something, this may be particularly true when we're working on hotfixes, for example. Successful people take a step back and are a little bit more strategic at this point. And they might need to think about returning to the idea of making some trade-offs. It's not just about being responsive and getting a solution to this immediate customer problem. It's important that we avoid these little quick workarounds and little poor decisions that tend to erode our systems over time. And finally, they understand that software is a team sport. Just like any other team, it's not enough to just have good players. You also need to have strong leadership. You have to have somebody there who's keeping us all together, making sure that we're all following the same playbook and running the same play, and that we don't have any weaknesses within our team. So that's a summary of what I've seen makes a truly great developer. If you aspire to be one of them one day, what does that path look like for you? What should we be doing, or how should we be approaching it? Well, to start with, we need to build a framework for this that allows us to answer the question, how do we evaluate these developers that I'm talking about, and what should they be learning? Let's start thinking about this in terms of software engineering and not just coding or software development. I'm sure you've heard that before. We tend to throw this word around a lot, software engineering. But in order for us to dig into this, we really need to understand, what does software engineering really mean? Let's make sure we have a shared definition of what that is. And then also, let's talk a little bit about what the end game will look like when we as an industry are actually treating software development as an engineering discipline. What should we expect? And then finally, we need a knowledge and skills map so that we can be rigorous about evaluating people and developing growth plans. So I think this is the best definition for software engineering. It comes from IEEE, which is, of course, a trustworthy source. They've invested a lot of time and energy into trying to define it, so I'll just read it to you. It is the application of a systematic, disciplined, quantifiable approach to the development, operation, and maintenance of software. In other words, the application of engineering to software. Now, one thing I like about this, if you look at the definition of other engineering disciplines, they look very similar, short and to the point. And it contains the word systematic. This means we have a method. We have a system for how we develop software. Discipline means we're following that method. We're consistent in the way we do things. We're not just randomly choosing approaches. And then quantifiable, which means we have some sort of way of measuring how we're doing. We have a feedback loop and can improve things. So the next thing is, what will it look like when we are practicing software development as an engineering discipline? Well, first I'll tell you what it won't look like. Over the past 20 years, I've observed that the success of many software projects relied very heavily on what I would call a virtuoso performance by a handful of developers. These are those developers that have enough tacit knowledge and skill that they are able to carry the project over the goal line, despite the fact that the rest of the team might not be contributing in a useful way and might even be holding them back. For some of us, the project feels like a death march where we are working 60, 70, 80 hours a week to try to get things going. Now, we could continue to try to go down this path of what we've done before, but here's the challenge. The types of problems we are trying to solve today, they are orders of magnitude more complex than the problems we were solving in the past. I once worked with a team that built an e-commerce platform. This was probably 2 decades ago. And at the time, it was really hard work. There was really some tough problems to solve with that. We had some commercial success with that platform, but when I look at that now and I look at what we built and our efforts, they look almost naive in terms of what e-commerce looks like today. The industry has become way more complex. And one of the companies we launched in the last 10 years builds computer vision applications for athletic performance in healthcare. 10 years ago, if you'd have told me that we were going to build computer vision applications with a small group of people in Lincoln, Nebraska, I would have thought that's way out of our league. We would never be able to do that. So software is everywhere. I don't need to tell you that. And the complexity of the problems we are trying to solve with software will continue to grow. What the future could look like, and probably should look like, is to have this body of knowledge, this shared understanding of what is software engineering and what does it mean. And then when we all understand this, this becomes our guide for how we approach things. Think about if I hire a bunch of civil engineering firms to design a bridge over the Missouri River. Do you think they're all going to be radically different in their approaches? Would they apply a random or completely different set of rules to each design? No. The bridges are going to look a little different, for sure. They might use some techniques that have worked for them in the past, but they're all working from the same principles, and they are all guided by those same principles. So with that, the solutions to our problems that we are dealing with should be shared and should be things that we can reuse over time. This is actually something we're seeing today. 10 years ago, the cloud was all about hosting applications and virtual machines. But since then, other services in the cloud became available for us to use, whether it's authentication services or machine learning services or any of the other platform as a service that's out there. These are hard problems to solve, but they are common problems, and we can save time and use these services to build our own applications. I think we're seeing this more and more today. So using these first 2 bullets, software developers with average amounts of experience should be able to tackle many problems with consistency and do it routinely, predictably, and have success. Much like if I go to a civil engineering firm and say I want to design an overpass, they're going to do it and be successful. That's what you want. You want that predictable outcome. And then for some novel things that are exceptionally challenging, like building cloud services or maybe designing an autonomous reentry system for a Mars rover, maybe that's where our virtuoso performances will be focused. For most of us, it's unlikely we're going to be involved in solving those types of exceptionally challenging problems. The vast majority of us should be able to manage and predictably solve the problems we are working on. With very few exceptions in my 30 years, I have never doubted we would find a solution to the problem in any of the projects we have worked on. I think for the most part, the likelihood of finding a solution is deterministic, and it's those rare challenges that maybe require the virtuoso performance and an innovative or novel approach. All right, so the third thing we need is this knowledge and skills map. And I want to go back to IEEE again. So maybe some of you have heard of this, but I suspect many of you have never seen this before. And that is the Guide to the Software Engineering Body of Knowledge, or SWBOK, which is now in its 3rd edition. This is something that has been developed by IEEE over the years, and it is common for a lot of other engineering fields to have a body of knowledge. So you can go out there and find the systems engineering body of knowledge, the electrical engineering body of knowledge. This notion of a body of knowledge is very common, especially within academia, but also in much of industry as well. There exists a collection of what is known about software engineering, and this book is your guide to that. The SWBOK has some specific objectives of what they're trying to do. They want to make sure that we have a common view throughout the world of what software engineering is. They want to characterize and describe the contents of that body of knowledge. Now, to be clear, this does not contain the body of knowledge. It is the guide to the body of knowledge. What they're trying to do is provide you access to those authoritative resources that really contain the body of knowledge for software engineering. And then finally, they want us to use this to create curriculum. The University of Nebraska now offers a software engineering degree, and it's one of the few software engineering degrees in the country, believe it or not. Most people coming into this industry are still getting computer science degrees, which is kind of like getting a physics degree and then deciding to be an engineer. Going forward, we should see more undergraduate software engineering programs that are designed and built around resources like the SWBOC. So the SWBOC actually contains 15 of what they call knowledge areas. They try to characterize all the different aspects of software engineering into these 15 buckets, if you will. I'll go through these areas pretty quickly. There's software requirements, software design, software construction, there's testing, there's maintenance, all the kinds of things that we're used to doing on a daily basis as software developers. But then they cover software configuration management and software engineering management, which is kind of project management. Then the software engineering process. This is the software development lifecycle and things like that. They have software engineering models and methods, which is how we use systematic, repeatable structure to design and develop systems. Software quality, which is not just how we do quality, but how do we measure what quality really means? Software engineering professional practice, which is what it means to be a professional as a software engineer. And then software engineering economics, which is probably a shocker to everybody, but we're part of a business, right? Most of us are working in commercial businesses, and all the decisions we make have an economic impact. So this is an important aspect as well. And then there are three what they call foundational areas. It's a bit like table stakes in a poker game to get into the field, but it isn't really directly related to software engineering. However, they are essential bodies of knowledge that we should be aware of and that support the software engineering body of knowledge. So as an example, in other engineering fields, your first 2 years of college, you're taking physics and math and chemistry. You're not really taking any engineering classes. You're taking classes in these foundational areas. So for software engineering, one of these foundational areas is computer science. That's a whole body of knowledge in and of itself. Then there's also mathematical foundations, specifically things like logic and reasoning and discrete math. And then engineering foundations, some of those common patterns and principles and practices and techniques that transcend engineering fields. All right, so I have 15 knowledge areas, but that doesn't really help me. I really felt I needed to group these together to make sense of this. So I've come up with 5 separate areas, that I call foundations, management, execution, structure, and then professionalism. And I laid out the 15 knowledge areas within these various areas. I'm trying to build a map that I can use to evaluate the maturity and growth of developers. Since we're mostly talking about developers, I'm not going to focus much on the business management side, so I'll gray that out. It's part of the body of knowledge, but it's these other things I'm really focused on when we're really talking about evaluating growth of individual developers. All right. So how am I actually going to do this assessment? How will I define these growth phases and their focus? Well, when I was first developing this talk, I got to this point, I could not help thinking about one of my favorite lines from the movie Caddyshack, where Judge Smales says, "Ty, what did you shoot today?" And Ty says, "Oh, Judge, I don't keep score. It's not about the numbers." And the judge says, "Well, then how do you measure yourself with other golfers?" And he replies, "By height." Needless to say, I'm not going to be doing it by height. We will leave that to the folks at Caddyshack. What I did is I came up with some personas, leaning on our kind of agile practices and best practices and tools. These personas really reflect the personas within my own organization based upon my experience. So your mileage may vary, and it may not resonate with you, but it's kind of what I know, and I'm really just trying to illustrate a process, if you will, and a potential model for you to think about. And I recognize that maturation of any skills and knowledge is not a set of discrete transitions from one state to another. It's a continuum, right? So it's a little bit artificial, but I think it might help to make my point or give you some things to think about. I have 4 personas that I'm going to describe here. First, I'm going to talk about what their skill level is, and then what their blind spots are, which I think is very important when we talk about growth, right? We want, what are they not good at? And then I'll talk about what are some of the things that might really differentiate those people within that particular persona that are considered to be high performers within that level. And then we'll look at areas we have tried to focus on as these developers are growing, the target areas of focus and where we're pointing them. So the first persona is what I call the entry-level developer. These are people that are either self-taught or they might have gone to a code school or got a college education or an associate's degree. They probably have some generic programming experience from a few academic assignments, or maybe cultivated some internships, hopefully. They can probably build some websites with a light back end and are probably familiar with some development environments. Excuse me. They probably have been exposed to some agile methods, given that that's pretty pervasive now, even in college curriculums. They do have some skills, but they have some blind spots as well. Most don't have a lot of experience in developing actual applications unless they've actually worked in an internship where that was part of their experience. Another common blind spot that we talk about a lot is this notion of errors in judgment. When I talk to students coming out of college and see them working on a problem, they have a lot of knowledge, but oftentimes they don't see around corners. So they make errors in judgment. Nobody is maliciously making mistakes when they're coding, but it's these things that really cause problems over time, people just using poor judgment. They also don't have much design or testing experience. And probably the biggest thing for some of them is their gaps in foundational knowledge in computer science, mathematics, and engineering, similar to my experience. A very important thing that will differentiate folks in this category from others is a lot of internship experience. Students that have been through internships have a better perspective on what it really means to develop software. Top performers are also pretty motivated to grow and understand and learn. And the ones that are the best at that are the ones that aren't afraid to ask for help. This is so common for many people coming into industry, especially coming right out of school. They feel like they can't ask questions, like it makes them look weak or like they don't know what they're doing. Well, here's news for them. None of us really know everything, right? No one has the tiger by the tail. All of us have to ask questions, whether it's to Stack Overflow or to the person next to me. So where I think these people need to focus is, let's not just jump right into, hey, I'm going to be a great coder. Let's take a step back and make sure that we're really understanding this body of knowledge from computer science and to some extent the mathematics. I think it's absolutely critical that you get that foundation if you missed it. Maybe it doesn't have to all happen at once, but that should be part of what you're trying to do if this is you. Then the next thing would be, I want to go into software design and testing, because those are the things that people tend to be the weakest in. They tend to understand the syntax and the structure of programming, but they tend to not really understand what it means to do design and how to test. And finally, start exposing yourself to some of the concepts in software requirements and engineering models and methods. Start building a working knowledge of these areas so you have more context for understanding other roles and activities within your team. So this is what I'm using, kind of color coding here and levels of darkness for these areas to represent kind of their competency. So this is what the entry-level developer looks like in the map. Represents what they had some experience with software requirements and some experience with construction. Everything else is kind of a blank slate at this point, right? As you might expect. Well, we really want to focus here in foundations and start building knowledge and expertise in design and testing requirements and modeling, like I've shown with the red boxes. So here is the second persona, the experienced developer. You've got some miles on the tires now. You've had some experience. They typically have good coding skills across a lot of different technologies. They know how to program, they're good at that. Some of the analytical, critical thinking skills are emerging at this point as well. And they are starting to understand what it means to be a professional in this organization and the ethics around that. And if they're in the right organization, they're probably starting to see and understand the importance of some of these management processes and models and methods. And they probably have been providing support, so they've got some experience in maintenance. They can follow the patterns you've used in your organization over the years, but the problem is they might not be able to explain why they're doing it. They may not fully understand the underlying reasoning behind the patterns, but that's okay, they're learning. And error judgment, still a problem with this group, so going away anytime soon. And then understanding what makes a good design or a bad design. This is a very difficult thing for a lot of people to understand because we live in this world of gray decisions where we're not always certain of the long-term consequences. The top performers here have a quality I call humble confidence. You want people to have the confidence to go out there and tackle things, but you don't want them to feel like they are so confident they don't need help from anybody, right? Ideally, they have just enough imposter syndrome to get feedback and validation on things. These developers are also starting to be very organized and deliberate about their learning. They seek out what they need to learn or what resources they need to grow. And this is an important differentiator. They start to really care about the quality of testing. It's not just about fingers on keyboard and coding. So again, testing, it's so important. It should continue to be a focus. And it's such a weakness in a lot of these more junior people. They forget the fact that they have to do that. But we can also layer in thinking about the structural knowledge areas. How do we actually architect things? What are our methods for doing that? What are the things we do in software development process to help create these predictable outcomes? So the experienced developer map is starting to look quite a bit different from the entry level. They're getting a lot of construction experience. A lot of their doing on a daily basis is coding, right? So they're getting a lot of experience there, but now they have at least some working knowledge of a lot of these different areas. And maybe even over in the structure area, we're starting to fill this area out nicely as well. But again, we want to really focus on these areas highlighted by the red boxes. The third persona is the emerging leader. These folks are really starting to get it. They're starting to see what they're trying to do and advocate for best practices. They're stepping up to make sure that people are not cutting corners because now they follow the process and they've seen it work. Emerging leaders start to really understand the need for the application of a systematic, disciplined, quantifiable approach to software development. They probably lived through some bad experiences at this point and realize we want to follow the path. We want to be disciplined. And this one is interesting. They start to be empathetic and advocate more for the customer. Emerging leaders can effectively apply patterns and best practices not only in their own work, but they can coach others during code reviews. And now you start to see the errors and judgments decrease. They're making good, solid judgments in that world of gray that they live in. Well, testing experience and design experience are still emerging. This is a skill where you can't just read a book and you're going to be good at it. You have to do it. You have to practice it. You have to get feedback over time. But they're getting there. When emerging leaders get to this level, they have some confidence. They have some credibility. Problems come in and they're saying, all right, I can solve this problem. They can sometimes be a little too focused on being responsive when they really should take a step back and be a little more strategic. We've all seen something like this where we hurry to push a hotfix out there only to find out it broke something for some other customer. They need to be that person that has the judgment to say, whoa, whoa, and pump the brakes when needed. Top performers are starting to be able to coach others. They care deeply about software design, even if they're not quite able to do it on their own consistently. They're getting better at effective testing, and they're starting to seek out mentors to help them on their journey. Now we can focus more of our attention and learning on that structure area. They've got good coverage of everything in the execution, and this is what their map might look like. And these are the areas where we might want them to focus. The last one is the software engineer. They can consistently get successful outcomes on a project regardless of the complexity. They recognize when things are ill-defined or when we don't have a necessary process and we're leaving things to chance that could cause problems down the road. They're always looking for ways to not just follow the process, but to improve it. You know, what are the techniques that could be used to solve that problem or plug that gap in a process? And when they start to think about how we're engineering the software, we're not just developing software. In terms of blind spots, they tend to be the things outside of software engineering. When they get to this point, they want to start thinking about how other engineering disciplines solve problems. They should start learning about what systems engineering is and how it can help us be more effective in our software systems. They should start to be responsible for getting us to the point where we are practicing software as an engineering discipline. The top performers here, they're the ones that can help guide and define the process, the way we're doing things. And they often have the ability to teach as well as do. Those people tend to be your most valuable resources. Suggested areas of focus, well, go completely outside of software engineering body of knowledge. Start looking at other things going on. Start understanding what engineering really means. Learn more about systems engineering. The software engineer has a working knowledge that covers an even broader area of this map. And we're starting to see real deep understanding in some of those core areas. All right, so that's my 4 personas. So what should I take from this? How would I use this? Well, one thing I think is valuable is if you're not doing this already, is to do a self-assessment and use the SWBOC topics as a guide. Use this as a starting point, or use what I'm talking about as a starting point, or maybe modify this and evaluate where you think you stand. And be honest about it. If you are weak in some areas, it's okay. It just highlights areas where you want to focus, and then be deliberate about attacking those areas and tracking your journey so that you can create a path forward. Some of the best developers I've ever worked with were very deliberate about this. They had a path. I will focus on this and this and this. Personally, I have stacks of books that I just continue to accumulate and read and reference and try to understand. It's important to understand it's a journey, it's not a destination. And this is my skills map. I try to take an honest look at myself. This is where I feel I am at right now. It might surprise you that my software construction skills are maybe a little light. I often joke with people that I'm the worst programmer at Don't Panic Labs. So if you're relying on me to get a thing done, I would be relearning some of the language constructs every time I get in the code. But there are other areas where I feel like I have strengths, like my background in engineering. I was a systems engineer for the first 7 years of my career, and I leaned quite heavily on that for the last 25 years. So this map is where I'm at, and I'm continuously trying to fill the gaps. After more than 20 years of intense focus, I still feel weakness in areas, but I can rely on people from our organization and other people who have a solid educational background in computer science to really help me along. So if you aspire to continue to mature and grow in this field, you should recognize that the traditional education systems alone are not going to get you there. They're a starting point, and they're just meant to be a starting point. When I was in college, one of my professors was talking to my classmate who was complaining that he'd never be able to memorize all the steps to solve the complex problem we were working on. And what that professor said really stuck with me. He said, "I'm not trying to teach you to memorize this. I want you to learn where to go to find the answers. I want you to know that solutions to this problem exist, but it's up to you to seek them out when you need that information." You're also not going to be able to get all the experience you'll ever need in your current role. So if you're just relying on the job experience, it's probably not going to be enough by itself. It might even stunt your growth. And that's not to say you can't ever get there, but it will certainly slow you down. And being the best programmer does not make you an engineer either. Sometimes I feel like we really focus too much on things like, do I understand this framework, or can I use that framework, to the neglect of all those other areas of the software engineering body of knowledge. If you recall, when I was talking earlier about the best developers that I ever worked with, not once did I mention that they were highly skilled programmers. This is because I think most people who spend time in this industry do become highly skilled programmers. But that's just one aspect of being a great engineer. Your progress on this path will be dictated by your efforts, and to be brutally honest, where you choose to work. Some organizations are really devoted to trying to grow and improve the way we're doing things. I'm currently working with a large company in Omaha that is devoting substantial resources to try to level up their entire development staff and to help them gain a broader understanding of software engineering. And that's incredible. I just don't see that everywhere. So every organization is a little bit different, and I'm obviously not telling you to leave your job, but I think you should recognize that where you work could be a strength, but it also might be a weakness. Maybe you can advocate for change in your own workplace if you feel more could or should be done. One thing that organizations can do to help people advance and grow is to have a system in place for software development that enables the developers to put their learning into practice. I'm not simply talking about some agile methodology. I'm talking about a systematic, disciplined, quantifiable approach to the development, operation, and maintenance of software that covers both requirements complexity and the solution complexity. So the last thing I want to leave you with is a simple takeaway in the form of a couple of recommendations. I highly recommend that you try to identify mentors. And I put this in quotes because you can define mentors however you want. But find some resources that can help provide guidance and coaching that might point you in the right direction, or maybe help you evaluate yourself where you are at right now. There are probably people within your organization, but there are also thought leaders out there in industry who are active bloggers, for example, sharing their knowledge and experience. So getting familiar with them and kind of tracking and following them is really helpful. And then leverage the abundance of resources that are out there to help you with your gaps. I'm going to go over some of these here to end the talk. If you're looking for an index to software engineering, that point where you're saying, hey, I want to learn about this, where do I go? That's really what the SWEBOC is. But I would also throw in another book. If I had to choose only one book, I could only have one on my shelf. This is the book I'd get, Code Complete by Steve McConnell. He has attempted to try to bring together much of the software development body of knowledge in one place. It's an incredible reference that I've used often and for a variety of topics. As a result, you're going to see it often on the lists I'm sharing here. Concerning software design, this is really an eclectic book, a collection of books here. Some of these are very detailed patterned books like Design Patterns by the Gang of Four. Some of them are more architectural, like Building Evolutionary Architectures or Writing Software. Code Complete, again, not really about architecture, but does talk a lot about detailed design. And then you have Robert Martin's popular book on agile principles, patterns, and practices. And then you have this book down here by a faculty member out of Stanford called Philosophy of Software Design. It's only about 100 pages long, but it's delightful to read, and it's about bringing his industry experience to the classroom and learning from that. And I was really taken by that book. I really enjoyed that. And then there's this book by Fred Brooks, who you might recognize as the author of the Mythical Man Month. Well, he wrote this book called The Design of Design, and it's a series of essays on the nature of design, which I just thought was fabulous. Software testing. There are a lot of books on software testing, but this is where I would start. In Code Complete, McConnell devotes numerous chapters on defect detection and testing, in which he boils things down for you in a way that will get you started, and you can quickly put some really good techniques and principles into practice. And then you could follow that up with some deeper dives in some of the more dedicated books on software testing. When it comes to software engineering models and methods, I'll be honest, I don't have very many great references here. I have Yuval Loi's excellent book, Writing Software, which I mentioned earlier, and then Von Vernon's Implementing Domain-Driven Design. Those are the only two that I'm familiar with that are prescriptive enough to get you to understand the concepts and then be able to put them in practice. Remember, an average engineer should be able to take a modeling system and put it into practice. But I find that too many books out there that propose or supposedly are about software architecture and software system design leave things at such a high level that they don't really give you a tool set to be able to do this and put it into practice. Computer science fundamentals. I'm going to throw these up here because they're obviously super important. And I think a lot of us, especially people like me, come into this from other backgrounds and are weak here. And there's a number of resources that can help. Once again, Code Complete. And this book by Charles Petzold, Code, The Hidden Language of Computer Hardware and Software. Petzold was the author of the most popular book on the Win32 API back in the 80s and 90s. And this was a really nice, great look at how computers work on the hardware side. And it was just super fun to read. I really highly recommend that book. I'm dying to create a class that uses this book as a textbook. And then we have Rob Conry at the top there. He actually went about trying to write a book specifically for people like me who are self-taught. And he called it The Imposter's Handbook, which I title. He fully admits he's trying to learn computer science fundamentals, and he expressed the concepts in a way that was very approachable. Finally, here are some other interesting, useful resources that I think are great books. The Problem with Software is helpful if you really want to understand how we got to where we are at in software development, and it's a really interesting journey. Adam Barr does a great job, and it's a great read, especially for people in my generation who were around in the 80s when the PC revolution was happening. Making Software is actually a collection of rigorous research studies that apply to what we do today. They are studies of organizations like us, and it shares what the data tells us in terms of the things that work, what's working, and things that aren't working. Lean Software Systems Engineering for Developers is the book that Chad, Michael, and I worked on in 2020, where we put some of our thoughts in place from our experience building the development culture at Don't Panic Labs. And then Capers-Jones' book, Applied Software Measurement, has a ton of quantifiable data about just about any practice within software and how well those practices work. All right, and this brings me to the end. I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to everybody. I hope you found something you can take away from it. If you want any of the slides, here's how you can contact me and reach out to me. And I'd like to leave you with one of my favorite quotes by Gerald Weinberg, who is pretty famous in the field of computer science and actually grew up in Nebraska, just outside of Lincoln. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Amber.
Thanks, Doug. That was really interesting. I have some questions myself, and we have some that have been posted within the chat. So I'm gonna start with my own question. I'm curious if you have a method like at Don't Panic Labs for using this kind of model and framework to help with career planning progression for your own software engineers. Is it in any way part of your system of like job profile, job description, career progression? Like, do you think that this is just a tool for me as an individual or me as a manager to kind of give some hints for growth for people, or is it possibly more than that?
Was that just one question?
No, it was like 5. I can't be trusted to ask a short, simple question.
Yeah, no, no problem. Um, let's see. I'll try to answer it this way. So, um, we have spent a lot of time over the last, I'll call it the last 6 years, trying to mechanize a progression for folks working at Don't Panic Labs. And one of the things we've done there is to try to be more explicit about expectations of the different roles. Now, these personas don't line up directly with titles and everything, but they, I obviously I used our company as a model for this, so I was able to put certain people in certain buckets. And then about 6 years ago, we started looking out there to see what sort of training and education might be available that would be more focused on some of these other knowledge areas in software engineering. And sadly, there just isn't much out there. There's not much professional development in that area. And so what we did is we actually started, we built a curriculum around this that we started offering for companies around in the Omaha, Lincoln region, and for our own employees. So we kind of said, well, there's nothing out there. We've spent a lot of time thinking about this. We'll keep learning this and build curriculum that we can then hand off to our developers. So we're trying to, we're trying to support them in that way by providing more structured curriculum. But again, I would love to tell you that everybody in our company is diving into that curriculum and taking advantage of it, and it's just not the case. You still, people, it's still up to the individual to really take on that responsibility and that accountability. So that the old, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't necessarily make them drink.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think I'm imagining that though there's a mechanism where a manager could use this idea to uh help a entry level engineer, an entry level developer kind of create a growth plan.
Yep. Yep. And I would share too, a company called Constructs, Construx, actually was founded by Steve McConnell. They did something quite a few years ago that was really interesting. It's not exactly what we're looking for general engineers, but they created this thing called the Professional Development Ladder. And what they did is they tried to create coursework that would in a matrix of competencies at different levels. So they use kind of a maturity level 1 through 5. And then they have some content and that supports that. But there you're kind of picking you want to be an architect, I want to be a product owner, I want to be a quality assurance manager. So it's maybe more role-based rather than a generalized software engineering. But that's the best example of somebody out there who I felt really tried to develop some professional development around this.
Okay. So questions from our audience. Carl wants to know, have you seen challenges where best practices, in quotes, can cultivate automatic expectations to use it versus encouraging critical thinking to ensure it is the right selection for the scenario? If so, do you have guidance on how to cultivate a culture where engineers vocalize this critical thinking of how a referenced best practice may not be the best for the problem set?
Yeah, that I mentioned that a little bit there about this idea of a cargo culture. If you're familiar with that, it stems from World War II. It was kind of more of a social psychology experiment where people on these islands where the U.S. military would come and use as landing strips, and then they'd build out this landing strip, and there'd be native people there that the U.S. military would be giving them food and everything, but then they would take off. And these people got dependent upon that, and so, but they didn't know how to get them back, so they built fake landing strips and fake air towers, thinking that they would come back and deliver the goods. So that you don't want to just be super dogmatic about that. And hopefully, I wish I could tell you that, well, we all know we're all software developers. We know that most of the problems we're solving are wicked problems, not that they're evil, but that you really don't fully understand the solution of the problem until you've actually solved it. And so I think it's important for leadership to understand that it's still engineering, right? It's still some discovery. It's still making those trade-offs. It's listening to the experts to, like I said, we're often choosing between two desirable outcomes, and we have to weigh that. So I don't know that I've seen it specifically that, being in an organization where it's like, well, all we have is a hammer, so everything better look like a nail. Um, um,
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen that here, or like one person read the design pattern books and decided you needed to use the builder pattern, we need to use the factory pattern, and then pretty soon we've got unnecessary factories all over the place, or
yeah,
unnecessary, like somebody just got excited about the builder pattern and they, painted everything with that color.
yeah,
Um, it kind of reminds me of the bridge analogy that you made, I guess, where like you say that in civil engineering all firms would build this basically the same bridge, and there are known kinds of bridges, right? Like, but the lay of the land, the ground on each side, the width of the bridge is going to make a difference, or the width of the water is going to make a difference as to how you apply the pattern, right? And that's the kind
yeah.
of space where the engineers experience and ability to not make errors in judgment becomes
Important.
the key. Right?
Yeah, yeah, you're exactly right. And that's, yeah, that understanding the context, understanding the environment we're working in, and again, some of these trade-offs you might be making. Yeah, we could use this pattern, but it might have a negative impact on this other thing we might want to do. It might, yeah, that's a great example. It's not just about the bridge, it's about where the bridge is going to be located. It's about the
Right.
environment it's going to be in. Yeah.
Right.
And you mentioned
Okay.
something. You mentioned something about somebody learned the factory pattern. Now every bit of software they write's got a factory pattern in there, and it reminded me of an essay that Fred Brooks wrote called "No Silver Bullet," and he described two types of complexity: this notion of essential complexity and accidental complexity. And the essential complexity is the nature of the problem we're trying to solve. And we can't change that. But we can change is the additional complexity we add in that is superfluous, that is what he calls accidental complexity, and that we really need to try to minimize that accidental complexity because it just makes our job that much harder.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned this, that engineers like to be clever, and they put complexity in because
Yep.
they think they're being clever.
Specifically the
Uh,
younger engineers for the most part.
yes, because those of us who are not younger have tried to debug our own code 5 to 10 years later and thought, "What the heck was I thinking?"
Yeah,
Um,
you nailed it. That's exactly right.
okay, Danielle has a question. Frame engineering maturity and the relationship with product owners, designers, and other non-engineering roles that are necessary for a good product, but not necessarily software engineering themselves. Like, I guess I'm taking this question is the where is the plays well with others aspect in in the graph.
Yeah, well, I mean, to some extent that would follow in under professionalism, if you're looking at the knowledge areas. I
Mhm.
actually thought the question was going in another area. It's like, is there relevance within the software engineering body of knowledge for people who are not going to be developers, that are going to be product owners or analysts, things
Oh.
like that? And there are that, I'd mentioned some of those management knowledge areas specifically that I didn't really discuss as part of my matrix. It does that. The body of knowledge is pretty comprehensive, and it takes you through the entire life cycle. So I think there's, you could, if I was building something out there for a project manager, for example, somebody who that's their role, I'd probably have a different knowledge map for them, but it would probably still be based primarily on the software engineering body of knowledge. And then there's probably, the systems engineering body of knowledge is an interesting kind of parallel set of, concepts and things like that that is complementary to software engineering. That's another one that kind of may overlay with some of those other roles within an organization, like project managers and things like that. So
Um, all of this continuous learning, how do you build in or structure or encourage encourage folks to make or find or give, depending on your perspective, the time to make that part of your life? Is it part of your standard workday? Is it all outside of your standard workday? How do you suggest people balance some of this growth and education with with their project work or their required tasks?
Yeah. So you're probably not gonna like this answer, but I mean, we're probably no different than a lot of organizations. We have a hard time really dedicating significant time for professional development within the workday. I mean, I wish we could give people more time, but it's tough, for a lot of businesses to be able to do that. And so it's not that we don't give any time, but I'll be honest, the people who are really differentiating themselves, and that's one of the reasons I really wanted to have that in there as part of this assessment. Those people are working on it on their own time. It's I wouldn't say they're spending another 40 hours a week on it necessarily, but they are spending time on it, or they're carving out opportunities to talk to more experienced people, or they're sharing information when they can with other people. So in my experience, those people that really separated themselves, all of them, I can't think of any one of them that didn't really spend a significant amount of their own time and energy to improve themselves.
Sure. I personally find that if I've got to read a book that's not, you know, fiction, fantasy, whatever, that I'm better off doing that during the workday. My brain doesn't concentrate on that kind of thing at 8 o'clock at night. But it is it's a true story. Um, but but it is a thing, like that's my 10 o'clock in the morning break from regular work, right? Is go spend 30 minutes reading something else.
Yeah. My Saturday mornings and Sunday mornings early are my reading time because I'm more of a morning person and nobody else really is up around the house. And I don't really read fiction that much. So, that's when I really, and I'm just alertist in the morning. So that's time I've always carved out to, I might spend 4 or 5 hours over a weekend reading, not necessarily software engineering books, but that often they are part of what I'm reading during that time.
Makes sense. That's my running plus podcast time. Then that way
Yeah.
you're doing two things at once.
Yeah. That's what you need, more podcasts on this, right? Some more.
More podcasts in the list of recommendations, or the audio version of some of those books is probably either non-existent or very difficult if there's diagrams and
Yeah.
such.
Yeah. But there's good ones out there. Um, there's some guys. .NET Rocks has been around forever, and they're not strictly about Microsoft .NET, but that they've got thousands of episodes, and they are all fascinating, and talking about a number of different topics. So if you really want to hear some thought leaders talking about different topics, that's a good podcast to be listening to and picking out some things. Like I said, they've been doing it for 15 years, I think.
Wow. Um, Another question. At the highest levels, you mentioned learning about things outside of software engineering, but tangentially related. What kinds of complementary subjects would you recommend? Philosophy comes to mind, complexity theory or sociology of cooperation comes to mind. What else?
I would think all of those, because I think whatever you're passionate about, anything you do outside of there is going to help. For me, I'm really into systems engineering because that was kind of how I got introduced to the career field. But every one of those will be valuable. And actually, this brings up something that concerns me a little bit. I didn't really focus on it here, but when I got into this career field, and I didn't write software for the first 7 years, but starting about 95, I was software is part of what I was doing. Pretty much everybody I worked with, none of them had computer science degrees. They were either accountants, or one guy drove tanks, one guy had a divinity degree from Harvard. I mean, it was all over the board. I'm not kidding. That's the story. And then I was the closest thing at,
With electrical engineering, sure.
and so I think that was, obviously we were all kind of self-taught, and that comes with its own liabilities. But I'll tell you what, that group of people brought unique perspectives to every single problem we had. And now, if you look at my
Oh, I'm
organization,
sure.
Most people are computer science degrees or with the occasional computer engineering degree. And I worry, I don't have any data to support this, but I worry that we're too focused on in our formal education in those areas. So I do encourage people to explore other things, to have other interests outside of software. And I'm always interested to find that one person who might be more like me that
Mm,
long journey and bring them in there and throw them in the mix because I just think you get a good diversity in general in problem solving, whether it's gender, racial diversity, it all the data supports it.
sure. Sure. The team member whose original career goal was to be an auto mechanic, and then he decided that was better as a hobby and not a job, and he still
Yeah,
does cars on the sides. Um,
yeah.
yes. Um, okay, let's do one more question. Carl also asks, in growing others on teams, I feel it is often valuable to see how coachable someone else may be, um, such as receptive to feedback, good listener, vocal about sharing their understanding. Do you have advice on how we can assess ourselves about this to get honest feedback from team members on how coachable we are?
Huh, that's interesting. Huh.
Carl always has good hard
Yeah,
questions.
Carl, that's a good question, Carl. I don't have a quick answer for you on that. As the question was being asked, I again I thought back to that would be a person's coachability would be the one of the negatives that their lack of coachability would be something that negatively differentiates them from their peers. So, I have some people that probably the biggest problem I see is those people that really feel like they know everything. I'm 5 years into my career. There's nothing more for me to learn, sort of thing. So, but yeah, I mean, the one thing that has helped with us in terms of creating honest conversations and honest expectations is, like I said, to be very specific about what the expectations are. And I mean very specific, not just, hey, you're going to be a good coder. No, we're saying that these are the sort of things that you're going to do routinely and do well. And I think some of that can be factored into there so that you're actually, you're able to give people feedback on whether some of that stuff. And maybe create that as a way, use that as a tool to kind of have that conversation. I've always found it difficult to just walk up to somebody and say, there's just something about the way you're acting that's really not jiving or not fitting in with the team. I'm much better off with something that is a little more of a framework, which is exactly why I even kind of contemplating building this talk is I needed some way to be able to look at a group of people and say, why is it that I feel like Amy is doing such a great job and Jeff over here is not? It's sometimes hard to quantify that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a topic that's been it wasn't my question, but it is a topic that's been on my mind though as I look at my teenagers and team sports, and that's what high school coaches are looking for too, right? You'd rather have the kid who takes a correction and says, "Yeah, I'll try it," than, "No, I'm not going to do it that way." But we don't think about that as much in our professional lives, or that coachability is continues to be important.
But that those people who are not coachable they're going to fall behind, right? I doubt that Cerner is probably like a lot of organizations. Those people probably don't have a lot of support for advancement and things like that in many cases. So
Yeah. Yeah. Or they get so far and then their lack of coachability becomes the blocker.
yep, that's the
Uh,
limit factor. They've hit a ceiling. Yep.
yes. Okay, well, it's 3 o'clock, so I think we need to land this plane. Thank you so much for joining. Enjoyed your talk in this conversation. And we'll definitely stay in touch, get the slides, and keep seeing how we can use this at Cerner.
Yeah. Well, it was my pleasure. Thanks for asking me. Take
Yes,
care,
no
everyone.
problem.
Bye bye.
Bye.